Hey JPEG shooters, today on the channel we are going to talk about using HDR mode on your camera. In fact, we're not leaving you raw folks out either. There's something for you too. So HDR stands for high dynamic range, and it's often used for a scene where there's different light levels within the scene. Typically there's going to be some darks and some lights and everything in between, and what you're trying to do is capture the even light throughout, and that's what a high dynamic range photo does for you. HDR. So an example of a scene that might have some darks and some lights is this scene right here, where I may be trying to get the flowers on the side of this hill. The sun is right above us and it's casting shadows on this side of the hill, and then on this side of the hill it's nice and bright. So in this case you might want to use HDR mode, which will take 3 consecutive shots, a light one, a dark one, and one more centered, and try to put those all together in camera, and that JPEG should come out pretty well exposed. Tip number 1, use a tripod. A tripod will ensure the best outcome for keeping every image lined up. Again, there's 3 consecutive images that will be taken during an HDR mode photograph, and you want to keep them as best lined up out of the edit, and then in the camera it'll put them together in JPEG. But know that if you also shoot RAW and you choose to keep the original source images, you'll be able to line them up in post. More on that a little later. Tip number 2, choose the right scene. It's super important to choose something with a lot of contrast in it, perhaps a landscape with some dark shadows and some bright skies. That way the machine will understand what it's trying to do. Because if you choose something flat or has the same brightness throughout, then you're more than likely not going to get the contrast or the results that you're looking for in a high dynamic range photo. Tip number 3 has to do with your JPEG output file and the ability to shoot RAW and save your 3 source files. So I mentioned earlier that the output's going to be in JPEG, so it's going to combine those 3 images and try to give you a nice, well-exposed image from the front to the back, from the lights to the darks and everything in between. But know that you can keep your 3 source files, which will be RAW files, if you wish, that's your choice, and then you can use those in post to also do the same thing in an HDR edit. So know that you can keep your RAW files just as backups in case you don't quite like how the JPEG turned out. So before we set up our camera for HDR mode, let's review the 3 tips real quick. Use a tripod whenever possible, select the right scene, get a contrasty scene so you have the best result for HDR mode, and then finally, and this is just an extra tip really, tip number 3 has nothing to do if you're only going to shoot JPEGs, don't worry about RAWs at all, but if you're a RAW shooter, because I promised something for the RAW folks, then save those source files in RAW, and then you can use them later in your editing software to get the scene you want if the JPEG did not work out. Check mic 1, 2, check. So now what we're going to do is set up our camera for HDR mode. Now HDR mode is not exclusive to Canon. You have it on Sony cameras, Nikon cameras, Panasonic, Fuji, and so on and so forth. But it's not on every camera, so check your camera's settings to see if you have HDR mode. So for Canon cameras specifically, you're going to want to go to the red shoot menu, page 5, and enable HDR mode. So once in HDR mode, you're going to want to select auto, or you're going to want to select one of the 3 EV modes, plus or minus 1, 2, or 3. The next thing you may or may not want to select is the effect. So you can leave it in standard or natural, or art standard or natural, or you can even try some of the other choices like embossed. Give it a go, see if it inspires you to do something different or another type of creativity in your shot that you maybe never ever thought about. And then the last 2 things I do is I do enable auto align images, and I save all my source images.
Enjoy a few images as I race back to the studio.
Hey, so we're back in the studio and I hope you find a use case for HDR mode. Until the next video, love y'all. Peace.